Lucas Morgan, a young genius traveling alone for the first time, is all set to bask in the luxury of first class on Skyway Airlines Flight 102. But what starts as a dream trip quickly turns into a nightmare when a flight attendant, Miss Caldwell, makes a shocking demand, telling Lucas to move to economy despite his first-class ticket. Confused, Lucas tries to reason with her, but the situation escalates in ways no one expected. What happens next? Watch the drama unfold, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking stories. At the start of the story, Lucas Morgan, a bright young boy traveling alone for the first time, settled into his seat in first class on Skyway Airlines Flight 102. He had been awarded this special trip as a reward for his outstanding academic achievements, and this was his chance to experience the luxury of first-class travel. The excitement was palpable as Lucas adjusted his seatbelt, carefully placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and gazed out of the window, eagerly anticipating his journey. His ticket clearly indicated Seat 3A, which he knew was a premium seat in the front of the plane. However, his peace was short-lived. A flight attendant named Miss Caldwell approached with a stern expression. She quickly informed him that he was in the wrong seat and demanded he move to the back of the plane. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only," she said sharply, motioning for him to vacate the seat. Confused, Lucas showed her his ticket, clearly displaying Seat 3A, but Miss Caldwell dismissed it immediately, insisting that there had been a mistake. The young boy tried to explain that his ticket was correct, but Miss Caldwell remained adamant, her authority unshaken, telling him that the seating arrangement needed to be corrected and that he should move to economy. Despite his protests, Lucas was forced to leave the first-class section, setting the stage for the escalating tension aboard the flight. Lucas sat uneasily in the cramped economy seat, trying to process what had just happened. This was his first solo flight, and he had been so excited about sitting in first class. It was a special reward for all the hard work he had put into his studies. His parents had always emphasized the importance of education, and this trip was meant to be a celebration of his accomplishments. But now, sitting in the back of the plane, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The confusion that had set in after being ordered to move was starting to weigh on him. He tried to remember the moment when he had boarded the plane. The flight attendants had greeted him, handed him his boarding pass, and guided him to his seat. He had been so thrilled when he saw the first-class sign on the overhead compartment above his assigned seat. But now, it seemed like none of that mattered. Miss Caldwell had made it clear that there had been a mistake. He even showed her his ticket again, pointing to the clear notation of Seat 3A. But she wasn't interested in hearing his explanation. The authority in her voice made it obvious that she expected him to follow orders, without questioning her. The passengers around him remained silent, watching the exchange, but no one spoke up in his defense. They merely watched as Miss Caldwell's confident demeanor stood firm, and Lucas was left feeling isolated. He looked around at the empty first-class seats in front of him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why was he being treated this way? He had followed all the steps, he had the right ticket, he had checked in properly, but none of that seemed to matter to Miss Caldwell. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Lucas couldn't help but feel a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had never felt more like an outsider. This experience, meant to be a celebration, had quickly turned into an embarrassing moment, one that made him feel small and insignificant. Despite the uncertainty, Lucas didn't give up. He texted his father about the situation, explaining what had just occurred, hoping for some reassurance or guidance. His father's response came swiftly, his tone calm and reassuring, "Stay where you are, son. I'll handle it." Lucas tried to relax, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. What would happen next? Would anyone step in? Would Miss Caldwell realize her mistake? As the minutes dragged on, Lucas sat quietly in the back of the plane, staring out the window, trying to distract himself from the discomfort. He could still feel the stares of the other passengers lingering on him, as though he were somehow out of place. He clutched his phone tightly, his father's calm message offering him a small sense of comfort. But even as he tried to focus on the scenery outside, his mind kept returning to the conversation with Miss Caldwell. Why had she insisted that he leave first class? Why hadn't she listened to him? Then, just as he thought the situation might settle into an uncomfortable silence, a voice spoke from a few rows ahead. It was a man, clearly intervening. "Excuse me," the man said, standing up and looking toward Miss Caldwell, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." Miss Caldwell turned toward him, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seat is for first-class passengers only," she said, as though explaining something obvious. But the man wasn't finished. "This boy's ticket is for 3A. That's first class, and he belongs there. I think you should check with the captain." His voice was calm but firm, and it carried an authority that made Miss Caldwell hesitate. Lucas couldn't believe his ears. The man, who had spoken with such certainty, had confirmed what he had been saying all along. He belonged in the first-class section. Miss Caldwell, though caught off guard, didn't immediately respond. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly taken aback by the man's intervention. After a long pause, she nodded reluctantly, muttering something about checking with the flight crew. The man, sensing the tension was far from over, gave Lucas a reassuring smile before returning to his seat. Lucas's heart started to race in relief. Someone had finally spoken up for him. The awkwardness of the situation wasn't over, but at least now, it seemed like the power dynamics were shifting. As Miss Caldwell turned away to confer with a younger flight attendant, Nicole, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope. His father had said he'd handle it, and now, it seemed like things might just work out. But the uncertainty still lingered. What would Miss Caldwell do next? And would she ever acknowledge her mistake? Lucas sat tensely in his seat as the flight continued, trying his best to push the discomfort aside. He had always been excited about the flight, eager to see his father and experience the rewards of his academic excellence. But now, everything felt clouded by the tension that had erupted so suddenly. The plane was moving smoothly through the sky, but for Lucas, every moment in the cramped economy section felt drawn out and uncomfortable. He continued to hold his phone, waiting for his father's next message. His father had always been his rock, calm and collected, and the text Lucas had received was no exception. "Stay where you are, son. I'll handle it." Those words, however simple, had a soothing effect. His father's confidence made him feel a little more secure, even though the situation was far from over. As the minutes ticked by, Miss Caldwell walked to the front of the cabin, her steps brisk as she approached another flight attendant, Nicole. Lucas could see their whispered conversation, but he couldn't make out the words. Nicole seemed to hesitate, a look of unease crossing her face, but Miss Caldwell, seemingly undeterred by her younger colleague's discomfort, continued speaking. It was clear that Miss Caldwell wasn't willing to admit any fault. She was still convinced that Lucas didn't belong in first class, despite all evidence to the contrary. After a brief exchange, Miss Caldwell dismissed Nicole with a wave of her hand, as if her concerns were irrelevant. She strode back down the aisle with renewed confidence, certain that her authority over the situation would prevail. But as she reached Lucas's row again, something shifted. This wasn't just about moving a child from one seat to another. It was about the larger issue at play, the assumptions that had been made, the judgment that had been passed. Miss Caldwell approached Lucas with a stiff smile, determined to resolve the matter once and for all. "I've checked with the crew," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a sense of entitlement. "There was indeed a mistake with your seating. You'll need to come with me so we can get this sorted out." Lucas stood, a lump forming in his throat. He had been calm up to this point, but now, standing up, he felt the weight of the situation. As he began walking down the aisle with Miss Caldwell, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. This entire situation had started over something so simple, a seat on an airplane, and now it felt like something much larger was at stake. "Why didn't you listen when I showed you my ticket?" Lucas asked quietly as they walked toward the front of the plane. Miss Caldwell paused at his question, her steps faltering for a moment. Miss Caldwell began, but she quickly regained her composure. "I did what I thought was right. I was just following protocol." Lucas, calm but firm, met her eyes. "Your protocol was wrong," he said. "I had the right ticket, and you insisted I move. You didn't even give me a chance to explain." There was a brief silence between them as Miss Caldwell led him back to the first-class cabin. She didn't respond, but her face betrayed a mixture of confusion and frustration. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Lucas remained quiet as they reached the front of the plane. He returned to his original seat, still wondering how something so simple had turned into such a complicated ordeal. The flight continued its course, and Miss Caldwell moved to the back of the plane once again, her thoughts clouded with the realization of her own misjudgment. It was clear now that Lucas had been right all along. She had let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and she had failed to treat him with the respect he deserved. As the flight began its descent, Miss Caldwell couldn't shake the weight of the situation. The boy, calm, composed, had questioned her authority, and in doing so, had exposed her own flaws. For the first time, she was left to confront the consequences of her actions. The weight of her assumptions hung heavy in the air as the plane began its descent, and Miss Caldwell's thoughts turned inward. She couldn't escape the realization that she had been wrong, and that there were consequences to that mistake, consequences she would have to face when the flight landed. As the flight continued its descent toward their destination, Lucas remained calm, his emotions more composed than Miss Caldwell's. The unease that had settled in her chest only grew heavier as they approached the airport. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, and every time she thought about them, a sinking feeling overtook her. The boy had shown her the correct ticket, had asked politely, and yet she had still insisted on moving him. It had been a mistake, and the weight of her actions was starting to settle in. Lucas, meanwhile, was quiet. He had done his part, he had stayed calm, followed the instructions, and even texted his father for support. But now, as the plane's wheels touched the ground and the captain's voice came over the intercom to announce their arrival, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. His father had told him to stay put, but how would this play out? Would Miss Caldwell apologize? Or would she simply pretend the whole situation hadn't happened? As the plane taxied to the gate, Miss Caldwell stood by the entrance of the first-class cabin, waiting for the other passengers to disembark. She hesitated before walking over to Lucas, who was preparing to leave his seat. The tension between them was palpable, and Miss Caldwell knew she couldn't leave this unresolved. "Lucas," she began, her voice quieter now, tinged with regret. "I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier. I made a mistake, and you didn't deserve to be treated that way. I should have listened to you." Lucas looked up at her, his expression calm but composed. He didn't respond immediately. He could see that Miss Caldwell's confidence had cracked. She wasn't standing tall anymore. There was no longer an air of authority, just the weight of her own realization that she had been wrong. "Thank you," Lucas said simply, offering a brief nod. His tone was steady, as if he had already accepted the apology, but Miss Caldwell could tell there was something else in his eyes. A quiet strength that spoke volumes about his maturity in handling the situation. Miss Caldwell stood there for a moment, uncertain of what else to say. The silence between them was broken only by the murmurs of passengers as they exited. She was left with the lingering discomfort of knowing that her assumptions had led to this moment. Her actions had been driven by prejudices she hadn't even realized she was carrying. As Lucas exited the plane, he nodded to Miss Caldwell, a small, acknowledging gesture. He didn't hold the incident against her. But as he walked down the jetway, Miss Caldwell was left to confront the full weight of what she had done, and how much further she needed to go in understanding the impact of her assumptions. As the passengers filtered out of the plane, the cabin grew quieter, the hum of conversations replacing the occasional announcement. Miss Caldwell stood near the door, waiting for the final few to exit, but her mind was elsewhere. The tension in the air felt thick as she replayed the events in her head. She had acted out of assumption, and it had backfired. Now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. Lucas had been polite and patient throughout the entire ordeal, but Miss Caldwell could feel the weight of her own mistake, pressing down on her. It was one thing to misjudge a passenger, but it was entirely another to make a child feel like he didn't belong where he was. He had shown her the ticket. He was right all along. Her authority had been unshaken by logic, and now, she was left to confront the fallout. The door to the cockpit opened, and Captain Reynolds stepped out, his expression grim. He had been in the cockpit throughout the entire exchange, only now coming to handle the aftermath of the incident. Behind him, another figure appeared on the monitor, someone Lucas hadn't recognized, but someone whose face seemed familiar now that she saw him on screen. Miss Caldwell, Captain Reynolds addressed her, his tone calm but stern, "I need you to come with me." The voice on the screen, which Miss Caldwell hadn't initially noticed, spoke up then. "This is Mr. Morgan. I'm the owner of this airline," the man said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I've been informed of the situation, and I'm not happy with how this was handled." Miss Caldwell's heart sank. She had no idea who the boy really was, and now, she was learning the truth. The young passenger she had so easily dismissed was not just any traveler, he was the son of the airline's owner. "Miss Caldwell," Mr. Morgan continued, "you are to return the boy to first class immediately. And upon landing, you will need to explain your actions to the board." The words hung in the air, and Miss Caldwell felt a flush of shame rise to her cheeks. The airline owner himself, and the captain, were now involved in her mistake. It wasn't just about seating anymore, it was about an issue of judgment, bias, and the broader culture of respect within the airline. She had always prided herself on her authority, her ability to make quick decisions, but in this instance, she had been blinded by assumptions. Now, she had to face the very person she had wronged and correct the mistake that had spiraled out of control. Captain Reynolds's gaze softened as he spoke. "You'll need to escort him back to first class and apologize. I'll make sure the rest of the crew is briefed about the situation before we land, but you'll need to address it when we reach the gate." Miss Caldwell nodded, her chest tight with both embarrassment and regret. She turned back to look at Lucas's empty seat. How had she not recognized him? Her mind raced as she considered the chain of events. What had driven her to act the way she did? She swallowed hard, steeling herself for the next steps. She had no choice now but to face the consequences of her actions, no excuses, no further judgment. She had to make things right, and that meant confronting not only Lucas but the biases she had allowed to influence her. As she made her way down the aisle to find Lucas, she knew this was a moment of reckoning. The weight of her actions was heavier than anything she had anticipated. What she had done was wrong, and the only way to redeem herself now was to apologize, to correct her mistake, and to take responsibility for the assumptions she had made. As Miss Caldwell made her way back toward Lucas, the weight of the situation settled in. She had been informed by Captain Reynolds and the airline owner himself, Mr. Morgan, about the gravity of her mistake. She knew the apology would be inevitable, but she had not anticipated the realization that it was not just a simple misunderstanding, it was a reflection of something much larger, something systemic that had to be addressed. Lucas remained in his seat, looking calm as ever, but Miss Caldwell could tell that there was something different about him. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet maturity in the way he handled the situation. The discomfort of the previous moments had already begun to fade for him, yet Miss Caldwell could feel the weight of her actions hanging over her. When she reached Lucas, she stopped in front of him, her breath steadying. She wasn't sure how he would react. Would he be dismissive of her apology, or would he accept it? The uncertainty was almost as unsettling as the earlier exchange itself. Lucas, she began, her voice soft but sincere, I owe you an apology. I made a mistake, and I was wrong to question your seating. I should have paid more attention to your ticket and treated you with the respect you deserve. I'm truly sorry for the way I handled it. Lucas looked up at her, his face calm, but there was no mistaking the quiet strength in his eyes. He didn't seem upset, but he also didn't seem to have forgotten what had transpired. He simply nodded in response, offering a slight, polite smile. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice carrying a certain level of understanding that Miss Caldwell hadn't expected. I appreciate your apology. The words, though brief, were enough to disarm her. The maturity Lucas had displayed throughout the ordeal was beyond his years, and Miss Caldwell felt a sudden pang of guilt for not recognizing it sooner. Here she was, the one who had been in a position of authority, and yet the young boy had shown more composure and respect than she had. Miss Caldwell hesitated for a moment before adding, You're absolutely right. I should have listened. I let my assumptions get in the way, and I'll take responsibility for that. Thank you for your patience. Lucas nodded again, still calm, still composed. It's okay, he replied, almost as if he was reassuring her. I understand. The words didn't absolve Miss Caldwell, but they did make her realize that this was more than just a simple mistake. It was a learning experience. She had been so quick to judge based on surface-level assumptions, and in doing so, she had undermined not only Lucas but her own integrity as well. Please, come with me, she said, finally recovering her sense of professionalism. She motioned for Lucas to follow her back to first class. I'll get you back to your seat. As they walked together toward the front of the plane, Miss Caldwell couldn't help but reflect on the larger issue at play. This incident, though small in the grand scheme of things, was a reminder of how easily biases and assumptions could shape people's actions. What had started as a simple seating mix-up had revealed much more, about her, about the passengers, and about the underlying problems that still lingered in society. When they reached first class, Lucas took his seat again, settling in as if nothing had happened. Miss Caldwell, though, was left standing in the aisle for a moment, grappling with the weight of what she had just learned. She had apologized, but she knew that the real work would come later, when she had to confront her own biases and work to change the culture that allowed them to thrive. As the flight neared its descent, Miss Caldwell walked back to the galley, her mind swirling with a mixture of emotions. She had just escorted Lucas back to first class, and the entire ordeal had left her feeling unsettled. Her apology had been sincere, but the truth was, it hadn't fully alleviated the weight of the situation. The calmness that Lucas had shown in response to her mistake only emphasized how wrong she had been in making assumptions about him. He had handled everything with such grace and maturity that Miss Caldwell couldn't help but feel both ashamed and impressed. She leaned against the galley counter, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to steady herself. The weight of her own actions was sinking in. What if Lucas had been someone else, someone without the support of a powerful family, someone who didn't have the resources to set things right? She could have easily dismissed him completely, making him feel invisible. It was a sobering thought. It made her reflect on the systemic issues that often went unchallenged, issues that had, for a long time, been buried under the surface of her own everyday assumptions. Meanwhile, Lucas sat in first class, looking perfectly at ease, his attention focused on the window. He didn't seem upset by the events that had unfolded, but Miss Caldwell knew that wouldn't always be the case. Some children might have lashed out, some might have caused a scene. But Lucas had simply stayed composed, and in doing so, he had exposed a much deeper flaw in how Miss Caldwell had approached her duties. His maturity in the face of such unnecessary adversity was a lesson to her, one she hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would be landing shortly. Miss Caldwell felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The flight was coming to an end, but the ripple effects of her actions were far from over. How would the airline handle this? What would her superiors say? She had no doubt that her actions had already been reported, and the consequences would be inevitable. She imagined the conversation she would have with the airline's leadership. She would have to explain herself, justify her decisions, and, most likely, face disciplinary action. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part would be facing the truth. She had let her own assumptions cloud her judgment, and now, she had to reconcile that mistake. The plane touched down smoothly, and Miss Caldwell took a deep breath. She had apologized to Lucas, but she knew the apology was just the beginning. The real work, the deeper reflection on her actions and the biases she had allowed to fester, was still ahead of her. As the passengers began to disembark, Miss Caldwell's gaze landed on Lucas once again. He was walking calmly down the aisle, his posture confident but not arrogant. When their eyes met, Lucas gave her a small nod, acknowledging her apology. Miss Caldwell nodded back, but this time, it wasn't just an acknowledgement of him, it was a silent promise to herself. She would work harder, learn from this mistake, and strive to never let her biases cloud her professional judgment again. As the plane began its descent, Lucas remained calm, his expression composed as the aircraft gently tilted toward the runway. Miss Caldwell stood in the back of the plane, a few rows away, her hands tightly clasped as the reality of the past few hours washed over her. The events that had transpired earlier weighed heavily on her conscience, and now, as the flight neared its conclusion, she felt an unsettling mixture of regret and anticipation. She had apologized to Lucas, but would that be enough? Was that truly the end of it? She had heard the stories of passengers who faced prejudice or mistreatment, only to have their voices silenced or ignored. What if Lucas had been anyone else, someone without the privilege of an influential family to correct the situation? She couldn't help but think that if Lucas were just an ordinary child, without connections to the airline's owner, his experience could have been far different, perhaps even worse. But Lucas wasn't just any child. As he sat in his first-class seat, now quietly watching the world outside, Miss Caldwell couldn't shake the fact that this was someone who had been treated unfairly. He had every right to feel angry, to cause a scene, but instead, he had chosen to remain poised. And in doing so, he had exposed her flaw, her inability to separate assumptions from reality. She had let her own biases cloud her professional judgment, and the consequences were now impossible to ignore. As the plane touched down, the passengers began gathering their things, preparing to disembark. Miss Caldwell moved toward the front of the cabin, trying to avoid eye contact with the other passengers. She knew that, despite the apology, the ripple effect of her actions would linger far beyond the confines of this flight. And the truth of it was, Miss Caldwell had no idea what consequences she might face. Would she be reprimanded? Would she face formal action? She could only wait and see. Lucas stood from his seat, grabbing his bag with practiced ease. Miss Caldwell stepped aside as he walked down the aisle, her gaze following him. He was calm, composed, almost unbothered by the incident. When he passed her, Lucas offered a small nod, an acknowledgement that didn't escape Miss Caldwell's notice. He had forgiven her, in his own quiet way, but she knew that this wasn't just about forgiving one incident. It was about something much deeper, about confronting the judgment that had been made against him without reason. She nodded back, but it wasn't just to acknowledge him. It was an unspoken promise to herself. This would be a turning point. She would learn from this, from the ways her assumptions had clouded her judgment, and she would strive to make sure something like this never happened again, not just to Lucas, but to anyone. As she walked toward the exit, Miss Caldwell glanced back once more at Lucas. He had already moved toward the gate, calm and steady, carrying on as if nothing had happened. And yet, to Miss Caldwell, everything had changed. The weight of the lesson she had learned today would not easily be forgotten. And perhaps, just perhaps, Lucas had been the catalyst for her own personal growth. A growth that would extend far beyond this flight and into how she viewed others, how she approached her work, and how she made judgments from here on out. As Lucas walked off the plane, Miss Caldwell stood quietly by the door, watching him go. She could still feel the sting of her earlier actions, but she also knew that this moment would stay with her far beyond the confines of this flight. She had acted rashly, made assumptions, and now she had to face the consequences, not just professionally, but personally. The moment Lucas had offered her that small nod, it wasn't just a gesture of forgiveness, it was a silent challenge. He hadn't raised his voice or caused a scene, he had simply been composed and dignified in the face of mistreatment. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful way to address injustice wasn't with anger, but with quiet strength. Miss Caldwell couldn't help but reflect on the larger impact of what had happened. The boy she had dismissed so easily was not just any passenger, he was the son of the airline's owner. The realization of how easily her assumptions had influenced her actions weighed heavily on her. She had failed to see past the surface, to recognize the young boy's place, regardless of his background. She had let her own biases cloud her judgment, and in doing so, had made a decision that was entirely wrong. The rest of the passengers had filed off the plane, but Miss Caldwell remained, facing the consequences of her actions. Security had already arrived to escort her. As she walked off the plane, she knew that the real work wasn't just about apologizing, it was about changing the way she viewed others, changing her approach to judgment, and striving to do better moving forward. Lucas, calm and composed, had unknowingly set her on a path toward that change.